Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Got it. Recording in progress. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah for everyone here. First, I'd like to start by commending everyone for making it here tonight. I know there's a lot more things that you could be doing on a Thursday evening than learning about something like the fiqh of zakat. But inshallah, the fact that you're here is a sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bi'idhnillah wants good for you. You know, the Prophet ﷺ said, Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fi din. Whoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants good for, if he wants good for someone, he'll give them a deeper understanding of the religion. And the Prophet ﷺ tells us, Man salaka tariqan yaltamisu fihi ilman, sahhala Allahu lahu bihi tariqan ila al-jannah. Whoever treads a path or takes a path with the intention of seeking knowledge, specifically knowledge of the religion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make for that person an easy path to paradise. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from that special group. Now I'd like to start by saying the fiqh of zakat, similar to the fiqh of inheritance, for example, that involves a lot of numbers, does require some focus. And I know it's already late in the day. So inshallah, I hope you guys had your cup of coffee. I'll try not to put you to sleep, but I definitely can't make any promises. We'll start inshallah with a few disclaimers, admissions, confessions. Firstly, I'm not a scholar, not a mufti, not a faqih. Anyone who knows me personally knows that already. If you didn't know that, then take my word for it. Definitely not one of those three things. And I'll be honest with you, I'm doing this today. I felt like when I was asked to do it, I know the importance of the concept or the topic of zakat, especially because it comes up often during the month of Ramadan. And it is a fard ain for those who have the money to pay it to know how to do it properly. So I've definitely felt that it's an obligation for this knowledge to be shared, but I'm a student like everyone else here. Alhamdulillah, I was able to get this picture here, which has the phone number for the AMJA Fatwa hotline service. AMJA is the American Muslim Jurist Association. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them. They have 4 days in the week where you have a time slot of about 2 hours, Monday, Thursday, Saturday, Sunday, where you can actually call and speak to a scholar with any question that you have on the phone, free of charge. I noticed that it's between 5 and 7. It's already 8 p.m. If they extended it to 9, I would have actually called them and had to do the rest of this presentation. But alhamdulillah, you have them Saturday, Sunday. Anytime you have a question, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them. I've sent people to them before. They actually answer the phone and they take their time to explain the answer or whatever question the person has. Secondly, I want to mention that this talk is not going to be exhaustive. I'm not going to be able to cover every aspect of zakat. Therefore, if you are somebody who has a specific asset class that zakat has to be paid on that I don't discuss tonight, such as crops, such as, for example, livestock, if somebody here is a farmer, then that is something you need to know. I'm not going to be able to delve into that tonight, of course, because of the time constraints. But like I mentioned before, anyone who's obligated to pay zakat is obligated to know how to pay zakat. Just like anyone who's obligated to pray, it's an obligation for them to learn how to pray as well. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to be able to discuss every aspect of zakat. Secondly, because of the time constraint, I'm going to focus mostly on the most common issues related to zakat. I'm not going to be able to provide detailed evidence for everything that I say. So you're going to have to take my word for it. But it is your role. It is your responsibility if you want to look into it. And you should definitely have that curiosity to look into it, to see the proofs behind some of the rulings that we're discussing tonight, to see how the scholars discuss those evidences, those who oppose them, how they responded. That is something that you definitely should do, but that requires, of course, more time. And I'm not going to be able to do that tonight. And thirdly, I'm not going to be able to give you every single opinion on every single matter, because some of the matters that we discuss tonight have multiple opinions from the scholars. So you'll have scholars who will say that you have to pay zakat on this particular asset class. Others who will say you don't have to, for example, or others who are in between. I'm going to have to restrict tonight's discussion to just one opinion. And if you're interested in finding out more, of course, the resources are there. We could discuss that, inshallah ta'ala, at another time. So those are the disclaimers. So let's start with the linguistic definition of zakat. What does zakat mean? Of course, it has a linguistic meaning that was known to the Arabs before the institution of zakat, or before zakat became an obligation on the Muslims. So the word zakah means to increase and to grow. Therefore, the Arab would say zakah al-ghulam, that means the child grew and blossomed, or zakat al-ard, that means the land, the usually agricultural land, it grew and it throve, it produced a harvest. So that's one meaning of zakat, to increase and grow. Secondly, to indicate purity. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. Successful is he who purifies it, meaning he who purifies his soul. So we see two linguistic meanings of zakat, to increase and grow, and how it relates to purification. And we see that, of course, with the actual meaning of zakat that we know, the shar'i meaning, because zakat, number one, it increases the blessings that you have in your wealth. When you pay zakat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, from your wealth, Allah increases the blessings of your wealth. Secondly, it relates to increase and growth because it helps grow the wealth of others who do not have wealth. The poor and the needy who are receiving zakat money, their wealth is growing as well. And it also relates to purity, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, خُذْ مِنْ أَمْوَالِهِمْ صَدَقَةً تُطَهِّرُهُمْ وَتُزَكِّيهِمْ بِهَا وَصَلِّ عَلَيْهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells the Prophet ﷺ to take from their wealth a charity by which you will, number one, cleanse them of their sins, and number two, purify them. It purifies you by causing you to be more detached from your material possessions, so that you prioritize your love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over the love of your wealth. So you see how the linguistic meaning of zakat relates to the actual technical definition, which we'll discuss next. The technical definition of zakat, as the scholars, they have various definitions for it. One that I like is حق محدد يجب في أموال مخصوصة بشروط مخصوصة لأصناف مخصوصة في أوقات مخصوصة. So this is a very broad general definition because there are various forms, there are various types of assets that require zakat. It's not only cash. And that's why he started off by saying حق محدد. It is a specified right. It's not only 2.5%. Yes, it's 2.5% on your cash, jewelry, for example, but it could be 10% or 5% for crops. And there are other percentages, for example, for livestock. So it's a specified right. They didn't give an exact amount because it varies, owed on specific assets. So it's not only on cash, it could be on trade goods, it could be on livestock, it could be on crops, for example. And it's owed under specific conditions. Not everyone has to pay zakat. Of course, you have to be a Muslim, for example. You have to possess a certain amount, a monetary threshold, which is referred to in the nisab. We will discuss that inshallah as well. It is given to specific categories of recipients, such as the poor, the destitute, but there are also other categories, such as the travelers in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as we will discuss inshallah, those who are in debt. And it's given at specific times. We know usually when we pay our zakat, we pay it once a year, but that's not for every asset class. For example, crops, they're paid immediately upon harvest. And also buried treasures, rukaz, which is paid immediately upon finding it. So that's why they left that definition as far as when it is owed, a bit more general. It's not only yearly. So moving on to the next slide. Of course, zakat is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Fortunately, by many, it's neglected. The Prophet ﷺ, when he tells us بُنِيَ الْإِسْلَامُ عَلَى خَمْسٍ, that Islam was built upon 5 pillars, we know he mentioned وَإِيتَاءَ الزَّكَاةِ, to make sure that you give zakat. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a harsh warning for those who do not pay their zakat. وَالَّذِينَ يَكْنِزُونَ الذَّهَبَ وَالْفِضَّةَ وَلَا يُنْفِقُونَها فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَبَشِّرْهُم بِعَذَابٍ أَلِيمٍ يوم يحمى عليها في نار جهنم فتكوى بها جباههم وجنوبهم وظهورهم هذا ما كنزتم لأنفسكم فذوقوا ما كنتم تكنزون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warns that on the day of judgment, those who hoard gold and silver and don't pay the necessary zakat on it, that gold and silver or that wealth, cash, trade goods, whatever it is, even if it's livestock, will be a form of punishment, a source of punishment for them on the day of judgment. So if it was gold and silver, for example, and he didn't pay zakat on it, it will actually be melted basically, or heated on the day of judgment, and he will be branded with that gold and silver that he refused to pay zakat on. The Prophet ﷺ also in another hadith says that a person's wealth that zakat is not paid on turns into a snake on the day of judgment that encircles the person and says to them, Ana kenzuk, ana maluk, I am your wealth, I am your treasure. So subhanAllah, this should motivate anyone who believes in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the day of judgment to immediately pay his zakat when it's due. It's like telling somebody, for example, imagine somebody has $10,000 in their pocket, and you tell them at any given time that $10,000 can combust and light you on fire. This person, if he's saying he'll take it out and immediately throw it out of his pocket, get it out of his hands, because he knows that at any point it can combust and cause his own destruction or his own demise. Likewise, the 2.5% in your wealth that you do not pay and take it out of your wealth and give it to those proper recipients, that will be a source of punishment for that person on the day of judgment as well. And we know Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, when he took on the role of Khalifa of the Muslims, there were certain Arabs who believed, or tribes that believed, they did not have to pay zakat anymore because the Prophet ﷺ passed away. So the Prophet, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he made it clear that zakat will continue until the day of judgment. And he said, لَأُقَاتِلَنَّ مَنْ فَرَّقَ بَيْنَ الصَّلَاةِ وَالزَّكَاةِ فوالله لو منعوني عقالا كان يؤدونه للنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لقاتلتهم على منعه. He said, I will indeed fight those who differentiate between salah and zakat. Those who believe that salah is wajib and say zakat is no longer wajib. And wallahi, if they withhold from me a baby camel that they used to pay in zakat during the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I will certainly fight them for withholding it. So we see how important of a pillar this is. And because it's important, because it is a pillar of Islam, it is beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala more so than your voluntary sadaqah. Just like how your 5 daily prayers, your salat al-fajr, for example, that you pray on time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves it more than the qiyam al-layl or the night prayers that you do. So that's why it wouldn't make sense for somebody to pray all night and then miss salat al-fajr, because Allah prefers salat al-fajr on time over the qiyam al-layl that person did. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Hadith Qudsi, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, مَا تَقَرَّبَ إِلَيَّ عَبْدِي بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيَّ مِمَّا افْتَرَضْتُ عَلَيْهِ. That my servant does not draw nearer to me with anything more beloved to me than that which I have enjoined upon him, meaning that which I have made mandatory. Therefore, this 2.5% that you give from your wealth every year, Allah loves it more, if it's done properly, of course, than the voluntary charities that you're giving. And alhamdulillah, Muslims, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase his blessings on this ummah, are from amongst the most generous and charitable communities. According to philanthropy.com, I'm sure many of you read that report, that says Muslims donate more than any other religious group in America. But it does not make sense for a Muslim to be generous with his voluntary charity and give it left and right throughout the year. And then when it comes time to calculate 2.5% of his wealth at the time that he owes zakat, that he starts to pick and choose the easiest opinions to minimize what he has to pay in zakat. No, be generous with your zakat, pay it in full, and do as much as you can of the voluntary charity, but don't be generous with the voluntary charity and then be stingy with the zakat, which is more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that which is you're punished for leaving off, though you're not punished for leaving off a voluntary charity. And zakat offers or provides many benefits to individuals, to society, to the ummah at large. Of course, it eliminates poverty and hunger by redistributing wealth. I mean, subhanAllah, if you think about the amount of money that exists in bank deposits around the world, according to the World Bank's Global Financial Development Report, to 2021, at that time, there was about $128 trillion in bank deposits around the world. I mean, you can't even fathom how great of a number that is. But let's just look at America alone. According to the FDIC, in America alone, in banks, there are about $18.5 trillion in deposits. Now, we're only talking about cash. I mentioned there's other asset categories that zakat is paid on, like crops, livestock, gold and silver, for example, trade goods, things like that, stocks, for example, as we'll discuss. But we're talking about cash alone, $18.5 trillion in cash in America alone, not the whole world, just America. If 2.5% in zakat was paid on that yearly, that would amount to about $462 billion. And somebody might ask, what's that 462 billion going to do for the rest of the world? Well, according to the United Nations, it would cost about $330 billion on a yearly basis to end world hunger. So just in America alone, just in cash that's sitting in banks, not sitting in people's pillows that they're hiding under their beds, for example, or money that they have stored away in safes. We're talking about just bank deposits alone. That would be enough to produce $462 billion a year in zakat, and only 330 billion would be necessary to end world hunger. So subhanAllah, you see the barakah in zakat. And it reduces, of course, class warfare, and it promotes social cohesion, bonding between Muslims in the community. I want you to just imagine, 1,000 years ago, where people lived in small villages. So everybody knew each other. So the poor people, the needy, those who are underprivileged, they would be walking in the marketplace and they would see the successful merchant who's always bringing goods from other lands, making, successful trades year in, year out. And they would pass by the huge farms that are owned by the successful farmers, or they would see the shepherd who has 100 camels, for example, which is a lot of wealth back then. Even today, it's a lot of wealth. And they would see them and their wealth is increasing year by year. Don't you think that's going to produce a little bit of tension, a little bit of envy? And that's why you had so many revolutions around the world, civil wars that were started by the working class who were just fed up and sick of seeing people getting richer and richer, and they're getting poorer and poorer year in, year out. But now when they see that rich merchant and he's making money year in, year out, he has all these successful trades that he's doing. And at the end of the year, when it comes time for Ramadan, he comes up to them with a bag of golden coins and he says, here, this is enough for the next year until I come back to you with more zakat. Isn't that going to change the attitude they have towards those successful merchants, towards those successful shepherds or farmers, for example? Absolutely, definitely will. It would promote social cohesion and brotherhood. And that is one of the great maqasid of Islam. And it provides an organic boost to the community or to the society, the economy at large. Because, people who just have money sitting under their beds, for example, or sitting in the bank, and they're every year paying 2.5% on it, at one point they're going to stop and say, you know what, let me put that money to work. So they might go and purchase some land. They might go invest in a business. They might go buy a house. They might go buy a car, for example, with that money. But either way, they're reinvesting that money back into the economy instead of just having it sit there and money is taking out from it every single year. So it provides an organic boost because doing that creates production, it circulates money in the economy, creates jobs. So there's many ways to see how it benefits society at large. I can't go into more because I see that if I do, I'm gonna end up running over my time. So let's just get into it, inshallah ta'ala. But first, I want to start with some common misconceptions. Before talking about how to pay zakat, I want to talk about some common misconceptions that people have when it comes to paying zakat. Firstly, is zakat due on wealth that is owned by children or those who have special needs? And I put a -H there to indicate that according to the madhab of Abu Hanifa, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala have mercy on him, that is not the case. But according to the majority, and that opinion is likely stronger, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, that yes, zakat is the right of the money itself. As Abu Bakr said in that hadith that I mentioned, فَإِنَّ الزَّكَاةَ حَقُّ الْمَالِ, that zakat is a right that is owed on the money itself, irrespective of the Muslim who owns it. So yes, if the conditions are met, even if it is a child that is not yet obligated to pray, for example, or somebody with special needs, then whoever is responsible for them has to pay zakat either on their behalf or by taking that out from that wealth every year and paying it. So yes, it is owed on wealth that is owned by children or those with special needs, according to the stronger opinion. Secondly, is it due regardless of my intention, why I'm saving the money? For example, somebody can say, Brother Tarek, I'm saving my money to get married. I want to go perform Hajj, and I've been saving for years for that. Do I still have to pay money? I'm doing it for something good. I'm not doing it just to get rich. And the answer is yes. You do have to pay it year in, year out on that money that you have, as long as it meets the conditions that we will inshallah discuss. Thirdly, regardless of irrespective of the intention for why you have that money, even if it's to get married or perform Hajj, if you have it for a whole year, then zakat is going to be owed on it. Thirdly, is zakat due on my wealth? Is zakat due yearly on the same wealth if it remains in your possession? In other words, if I have $10,000 and I pay zakat on that $10,000 today, and 1 year from today, 12 months later, I come back and all I have is that same $10,000 that I took out $250 for in zakat the year before. Do I have to pay money on it again? Do I have to pay zakat on it again? And yes, as long as that money remains in your possession and fulfills the conditions that we will discuss, you will be paying zakat on it every single year. Lastly, a person can ask when it comes time for zakat and they do the math, they're like, whoa, I owe $2,000, $3,000 in zakat. But then, shaitan comes and he's like, wait, remember all that sadaqah you gave throughout the year? You sent money to your cousins, you sent money to that, organization, so on and so forth. So he thinks that, what, alhamdulillah, I'm sure I gave much more than the $2,000 that I owe, so I don't have to pay anything else. I'm good. The answer is no. Unless you intended, when you gave that money throughout the year to your relatives, to your friends, or whoever was asking that was a qualified, needy recipient, unless you formed that intention beforehand, then you cannot go back and re-engineer your intention in retrospect. Because the Prophet ﷺ said, that actions are based on the intention of the person who performs that action. So you have to have the intention of zakat when you're giving that money. You cannot form that intention afterwards. I hope that's clear. So the categories of zakat, there are four major categories. Like I mentioned, we're not going to be able to discuss them all, but if you own one of these categories or more than one of them, then it is your obligation to learn, of course. Livestock is one. Secondly, that which is extracted from the earth, such as crops, minerals, buried treasure, under certain conditions. Number three, merchandise, which I'll discuss inshallah in a little bit more detail. And number four, gold and silver. Back then, their currency was gold, dinar, or silver coins, which are dirahim. Today, cash replaces gold and silver as a currency across the world, so it takes the exact same ruling. Simply because the Prophet ﷺ didn't specify cash because they weren't using cash at that time, does not mean that cash or zakat is not owed on cash. So what are the conditions of zakat? Every act of worship has certain conditions that have to be met in order for it to be obligatory for the person to perform it. Number one is Islam. Of course, zakat is not owed on a non-Muslim. So if a new convert, let's say Elon Musk, accepted Islam today, we don't have to say, congratulations, brother, jazakallahu khairan, pay up. You owe 30, 40, 50 years, however old you are, of zakat. You know, we don't have to do that because as soon as they accept Islam, now it becomes mandatory on them and they won't owe for another year. So if he accepts Islam today, even if he has $10,000 in the bank, he still doesn't owe until 1 year passes from the day he or she accepts Islam. So that's number one, Islam. Number two, the nisab, which is the monetary threshold. Of course, if somebody all they have is $5 to their name, they're not going to be expected to pay zakat. So there had to be a certain threshold. When you exceed that threshold, you become somebody who owes zakat. So that was based on gold and silver, like I mentioned, because that was their currency back then. It would have been about 85 grams of gold or 595 grams of silver, which today equates to, if you're looking at gold, $5,050 based on the more recent evaluation, I think from about a month ago. Might have to check it if you're paying zakat, later on in the year to make sure that those numbers are still the same, or $404 based on silver. So there are some scholars who said that if you have cash, that's all you have, then you should go based on the gold threshold, which is $5,050. Other scholars, and I believe this is a safer opinion, and I follow that opinion, even though silver has lost a lot of its value since the time of the Prophet ﷺ, with respect to gold, that you should be going based on the silver threshold of $404, which is not much. 2.5% on $404 is about $10. So anyone who has over $404, look at the next condition, that it remains over that amount for one whole lunar year. One hawl, it's called the hawl in Arabic, which is one lunar year. Not a year, which is based on the solar calendar, 365 days. We're going based on lunar months. So because lunar months, if you look at a lunar year, it's shorter than a solar year. So if you end up just waiting 365 days, you're going to be late on your zakat. So if you pay the 1st of Ramadan, for example, or the 27th of Ramadan last year, then this year you're going to be, your due date would be the 27th of Ramadan as well. So it remained over that amount for over a year. So if somebody at the start of the year had only, let's say they had $500, and 6 months into the year, that amount dropped to $250. Now they don't owe zakat until that amount climbs back up over the 404 and another year passes afterwards. All right, so it has to remain over that amount for a year. There are some scholars, like the madhab of Abu Hanifa, who said as long as it's there above that amount in the beginning of the year, and at the end of the year, they would still owe. But Allah, the stronger opinion is that it has to remain above that amount for the entire year. And fourthly, you have to have complete ownership of the money. So for example, if it's money owned by a nonprofit, by a masjid, for example, they have $50,000 in the bank that they use, or they're using for a project, for example, nobody has complete ownership of that money. It is an endowment, and therefore no zakat has to be paid on it. Likewise, money that has not come into your possession yet. So for example, somebody promised you a gift of $20,000. You don't start your countdown for 1 year until that money is actually in your possession. So those are the conditions. There are more conditions, but I try to summarize them into these four, but anyone that wants to delve more into the science of zakat will find that there are other conditions that the scholars differ over. Number one is Islam. Number two, having that monetary threshold amount over $404, based on the opinion that I'm suggesting, which is a safer opinion, especially because, like I mentioned, many people, even if somebody usually only has $400 in the bank, they likely give more than $10 in voluntary charity throughout the year. Likely. The average person certainly would. So for them to owe $10 in a mandatory zakat at the end of the year, inshallah, is not a tremendous obligation. Number three, that it remains over that amount for a whole lunar year, and that you have full possession. Bismillah. So now we're going to talk about trade goods and merchandise. By the way, I promised in the beginning that it is a bit dry, so you're going to have to, inshallah, focus. I'll try to think of some funny jokes to wake those of you who are already asleep up, but I can't promise that they will be funny. So let's just discuss, inshallah, trade goods. Trade goods, urud al-tijara, or merchandise in general, it's anything that's acquired with the intention of turning it into a profit. Okay, so for example, somebody goes and buys a car from a auto auction, right? He buys it for $10,000. He or she buys it for $10,000. Their intention for buying that car for $10,000 is not just to use it for themselves personally or for their family. Their intention is to take that car that they purchased for $10,000 from the auction and sell it for $15,000. So this would be something that zakat would be due on. It is a trade good or merchandise, and because they are intending to turn it into a profit and not use it personally, then yes, they would have to pay zakat on it. So that includes anyone who, for example, owns a supermarket, inshallah, halal supermarket, or a auto dealership, or somebody, for example, who has a clothing store, or somebody who has a grocery store. That merchandise that they have takes the same ruling as cash. They will pay zakat on it every year. Now, how does that work? Because people, for example, somebody has a grocery store, and you might get this question from people that do, that, for example, they have cash, but they're always converting that cash into merchandise and back to cash again, because every week they're buying merchandise, selling it, buying it, selling it. The point is to understand that that does not break the cycle. The person converting their cash into a trade good that they intend to turn into a profit does not break the 1 year cycle. It will continue because the intention for which they bought that merchandise is to turn it back into cash again. Actions are judged in accordance to their intentions. Therefore, they would continue that cycle as long as what they possess in cash and trade goods remains over that $404 threshold amount that I mentioned for an entire lunar year. They will owe zakat on it. So I give an example here. Somebody, for example, acquired $10,000 in cash in month one. Let's say month one was Ramadan. In month six, 6 months pass, and in the 6th month, after let's say they had no money to their name before that $10,000 cash came into their hands. So now they have to start counting down a year. 6 months pass after they acquired that 10,000, and they use the money to buy a piece of land that they want to turn into a profit by selling it. So they bought that land in month 6. Another 6 month passes, and he's back at Ramadan again, month 12. So that land that he purchased for 10,000 in month 6 is now worth 15,000. So the 10,000 that he had turned into 15,000. That $5,000 in profit did not remain in his possession for over a year, correct? It was only for 6 months because he bought the land in month 6 for 10,000. By month 12, it's worth 15,000. But nonetheless, because that profit is attached to the original purchase, the original capital that he used to purchase that land, he or she will still owe zakat on 15,000 at month 12. Hope, inshallah, that's clear. So it includes real estate that is purchased for trade. Now, if somebody purchases real estate for rental income, so somebody buys, for example, a building, not to sell it, but because they want to collect rent from the tenants. That's something they do for a living, or that's how they earn their money. In that case, that is not considered a trade good. What he has to pay zakat on, however, is the money that he receives from the tenants if he holds on to it for over a year. But the building itself, he doesn't, or the land itself, zakat does not have to be paid on it because it was not purchased with the intention of selling it. It was purchased with the intention of collecting rent from the tenants. Likewise, if they purchased the building to live in, of course, they're not going to have to pay zakat in that case as well. And that applies to any property that's designated for personal use. So for example, somebody runs a business. Let's say they have a furniture business and they have a delivery truck, for example, in a warehouse. They purchased a warehouse that they store their furniture in. They do not have to pay zakat on that warehouse, and they do not have to pay zakat on the delivery truck either, because those are not for sale, those are for use. Or for example, someone with a restaurant does not have to pay zakat on his ovens or their refrigerators, because those are for use and not for trade. I hope that is clear, inshallah. So if a person is in a retail business, they should evaluate their merchandise based on the retail value when it is time to pay zakat. If they're in the wholesale business, they could do it based on the wholesale value when it's time to pay their zakat. So I want to give you, inshallah, a hypothetical zakat situation. So this way you can, inshallah, put what you've learned to use. Let's say in month one, we're going to take Zayd, who's going to be the subject of this experiment. He had $0 in his possession in month one. Then he received a gift of $9,000. Someone, let's say his father, his mother gave him a gift of $9,000. They said, let's see what you do with this money over the next year. We'll determine if we're going to give you more afterwards. So Zayd takes this $9,000. Smart decision. He goes and he buys $4,000 in trade goods. Let's say he bought a car that he intends to sell for a profit. He also used that money, some of it, to cover some of his expenses. He lent some of that money out, and the rest he held on to. So then we come to month 12, and Zayd looks in his accounts, because now it's time for him to calculate his zakat. And he finds that he has, from the $9,000 that he received as a gift 12 months ago, now he has $2,500 in cash, either in his hand, if he has that money at home, or it's sitting in the bank. It's the same. And that would include cryptocurrencies. If somebody trades in cryptocurrencies or owns cryptocurrency, for example, or any other currency from any other nation, then that would take the same ruling as cash, and they would need to see what the value of it is on the day they owe zakat, to evaluate it based on that. And then the $4,000 that he used to buy that car, for example, that he intended to turn into an investment or a profit, it grew to $5,000. So he made $1,000 profit on it as well. So that $5,000 gets added to the $2,500 in cash. Then he looks at the stocks that he's purchased. Stocks, if they're being traded in the short term, take the same ruling as merchandise. So you would have to see what the value of that merchandise is on the day of zakat. And let's say he lent some of that money out. So he received the $9,000, some of it he invested, some of it he covered his expenses with, and some of it he lent out to friends. Does the money that is currently in the possession of his friends count as his own money that he has to pay zakat on? This is a very controversial topic. Would need its own 45-minute to an hour lecture. Definitely cannot go into it. I will summarize it by saying, if that money, and by the way, this includes mahr, for the sisters, for example, who got married and their husband said, Khafish, inshallah, you're going to get it. My word is good for it. Just give me some time starting out. And he owes her mahr, for example. That would fall into that category because it's a debt that's owed to her. So if the money is accessible, in the sense that if I were to demand it right now, if I were to call that person who owes me the money and say, I need my money now, and they would be able to cough it up immediately or give it back to me immediately, then it takes the same ruling as the rest of your money, because that money in reality is accessible to you. It's no different than the money you have in a bank, because when you put money in a bank, your relationship with the bank is lender-borrower. The bank is borrowing your money because they're using it when you have it in a savings account or checking account, for example, and you're in reality the lender. If you were to say that no borrower or no lender needs to pay money on money that's being borrowed from him, then that would mean anyone who has money in the bank does not owe zakat on it. And of course, that is not the case. So if that money is accessible to you, that you're able to demand it and get it immediately, then yes, you pay zakat on it. If it's inaccessible because the person does not have the money, or they're pretending that they don't owe you anything, you don't have a proof to show that they actually owe you that money, that you're able to get it from them in court, for example, in that case, because that money is inaccessible, you will not, inshallah, owe anything on it until you receive it. Once you receive it, let's say you receive that money from that person who wasn't paying you back, 3 years down the road, what you can do, inshallah, is take that money and pay 1 year of zakat on it, and then the rest you won't owe until 1 year passes after that. Of course, like I mentioned, there are many opinions on this. I'm sharing with you the opinion that some of my teachers have followed, and I believe is the most convincing. So if it's with somebody that you can demand immediately, and that includes mahr, if a sister is able to take her mahr from her husband, but she decided to let him hold it, she figured, you know what, that's fine, I'll wait a little bit, I don't need the money right now, and she's able to demand it immediately, then she should pay zakat on it yearly. If she's not able to get it because he doesn't have the money, or he just keeps procrastinating paying her back, same thing when it comes to money that you've lent someone, then you pay 1 year of zakat on it upon collection. And that includes money that was stolen from you that you eventually were able to retrieve, money that was confiscated that you were eventually able to retrieve. Once you retrieve it, inshallah, you can pay 1 year of zakat on it. So he calculated what he has with the $1,000 profit on top of the $9,000 that he received by month 12, he has $10,000 so far. Now, the question is, do I have to pay zakat on that full $10,000? What if I owe money? I'm not a lender now, I'm a borrower. I've borrowed money from people. Can I deduct that money from the zakat that I owe? There's different opinions here as well. I personally follow the opinion that it should not be deducted. Uthman, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, when Ramadan would come, he would tell the people, this is the month of your zakat. So whoever is in debt, let them pay it off. Meaning pay it off before your due date of zakat comes. This way you only owe on what you have left. But some scholars, modern contemporary scholars, some scholars of the past as well, did permit for people who have debts that are already due. So if your debt is due before your zakat due date, so let's say you pay your zakat on the 27th of Ramadan, and you have debts that are already due from the previous month, and you know the lenders are already calling and asking for their money. In this case, for those debts which are already due that you could not or you did not yet pay, you can deduce them from that 10,000 nisab that you calculate. But the better opinion, Allah, or the safer opinion, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best, is if they're calling you and you have the money, why not pay back the lenders first? Because you shouldn't be holding on to that money if you owe someone. The Muhammad of the Prophet ﷺ, there's severe hadiths warning about the person who has the money to pay back his lenders, but decides to procrastinate for whatever reason, for no good reason that is. So why not pay the debt back first and then pay zakat on what you have left? However, the scholars did permit for the one who has consumer debts that he's late on, that they can deduct them from their total nisab. From the 10,000, we can deduct, let's say 1,000, for example, if that's how much you owe. Secondly, monthly expenses. Scholars permit that if you have expenses that are due, like your electric bill, your rent, for example, payroll expense if you're a business, and those expenses are due right before your zakat due date, then you can deduct it. So you can deduct the $1,000 of rent, for example, the $200 electric bill, for example. You can deduct that if it's due now, for the month, not for the year, for the month only, if that due date is before your zakat due date in the same month. If a person has a mortgage, right? I mean, imagine if you told everyone who has a mortgage that you're in debt, you don't have to pay zakat. Half the country would not, or maybe much more than that, would not have to pay zakat. So that is not the case. A person who has a mortgage debt, let's say, for example, for their house, cannot deduce or deduct the entire value of the debt from their zakat. Otherwise, no one would owe zakat. Some scholars did permit for them to deduct 1 year of mortgage payments only. And that should only be done really because the safer opinion is to not allow that. In reality, I follow the opinion that you cannot deduct debt from your zakat because the Prophet ﷺ sent out many zakat collectors in the various hadith that we have recorded in the authentic books of hadith. And there was no mention of ask them if they have debts, and if they do, deduct the debts from the money that they owe. Nonetheless, because that opinion is adopted by many scholars, you can deduct 1 year of mortgage payments if a person has a mortgage because it's a debt, 1 year, and that should only be done if it's going to make it difficult for you to pay your zakat otherwise. So let's say if they owe $1,000 a month on a mortgage, then they can deduct 12,000. By the way, me talking about mortgages or stocks does not necessarily mean I condone them. Does not necessarily mean that, but we're dealing with the reality on the ground. People have mortgages, people buy and sell stocks. I'm not saying all stocks are haram, but I'm definitely not saying all stocks are halal or every type of investment is halal, but we're discussing them because people have those type of investments and they should know what needs to be done when it comes time for them to pay their zakat. So let's say Zaid that we used on the previous page, he had $10,000 in zakatable assets on month 12, but he had $5,000 in deductible loans. Some of the loans that we just mentioned, he had them that he can deduce from what, or deduct from what he has from the 10,000. So he deducts the 5,000 and it leaves him with $5,000. So you see $10,000 in zakatable assets, $5,000 in deductions from loans or bills or other necessary expenses that were due this month, and he's left with 5,000. So now he just wants to figure out the zakat that he owes on that 5,000. He can take the $5,000 amount, divide it by 40, and it will tell him that he owes $125. That $125 needs to be given to the proper recipients in cash. Can't go around buying things for them. No, you should be giving to them. It should be given to them in cash. There are special exceptions that maybe if somebody has a question, we can discuss that in the Q&A. And it becomes due right away. You cannot hold on to it and say, I'll give it out slowly when I feel like it, whenever I come across someone that needs it. No, there's always someone who needs it. As soon as it becomes due, that $125 is no longer yours. It belongs to the people who are the proper recipients, and you need to begin seeking them out. You could pay in advance. If somebody calls you throughout the year before your zakat due date, like a needy relative, like a cousin, for example, you can give them from your zakat in advance. And when the time comes to figure out your zakat at the end of the year, you can just deduct that amount from what you owe. But you shouldn't be giving it late. You can actually advance up to 2 years of your zakat, as it's recorded that the Prophet ﷺ did that for his uncle Abbas. So what about jewelry? Sisters ask about jewelry, brothers ask about it as well. So jewelry, again, subject that has many various opinions. Everyone has their own sets of proof. Some of them are stronger than others. This is the opinion that I'm going to share with you, inshallah. If the jewelry that a sister has, gold, we're talking about gold specifically. If it's a brother, it would be silver, of course. For a sister, it could be gold or silver. If it's held for savings, because she wants to save her money in the form of gold, or for investments, because she believes the value of gold is going to go up in comparison to the dollar, or for renting it out. Some people, maybe back home, more so common than here, rent out jewelry to young brides on their wedding date, for example. If it's for those reasons, savings, investments, renting it out, then yes, you need to pay zakat on that amount. If it's over 85 grams, or for silver, we mentioned 595 grams. But for the gold, it's due on the pure gold value of 24 carats. So if the gold you have is less than 24 carats, there's a formula that you can use, and you can figure out, inshallah, how much of it is actually 24 carats of pure gold. And that is what you would owe on only, inshallah ta'ala. Now, let's say someone has 45 grams of gold. If that's all they possess, they're not going to owe zakat, correct? Because we said 85 grams is the minimum. So if they had 45 grams of gold and that's all she possessed, then she would not owe any zakat. However, let's say she had $350 in cash. $350 in cash on its own also would not require zakat because it's under the $404 minimum threshold that we mentioned. However, because she has more than half of both assets, in this case, she would pay zakat because together combined, they would push her over the nisab, the minimum threshold. In such a case, she would owe, if she had, let's say, 45 grams of gold and $350 in cash put together. If the sister acquired the jewelry, for example, for wearing or for lending it out, some people lend out jewelry to brides instead of renting it out, for example. Hafsa, the daughter of Umar ibn Khattab, she would do that. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with her. And she wouldn't pay zakat on it for that reason. So if the zakat is for wearing, it's being used. The sister actually wears the jewelry. Or for lending, in this case, according to the majority of scholars, she would not have to pay zakat on it. However, if she doesn't wear it frequently, if it's just sitting in the closet, the drawer, for example, and it's only taken out here and there just to feel more comfortable about the fact, and worn here and there infrequently, just so she can feel more comfortable about the fact that she's not paying zakat on it, then in this case, no, it would definitely be better for her to pay zakat on it, and that would be closer to taqwa and piety, as my teacher, Dr. Hatim Hajj, mentioned. And she could pay the zakat on the jewelry by taking it out of the jewelry itself, by doing the math, seeing, how much of if she has 85 grams, 25%, 2.5% of that, how much the grams would be, or how many grams that would be, or by paying out the value based on the current value in the market. SubhanAllah, I'm taking a little longer than I expected. So inshallah, I'm gonna have to, even though this part of the talk is important. If sister, you don't mind just telling me how much more time I have? You got to keep track of the timer.
If we can wrap it up, inshallah, so we can open up for a Q&A, inshallah.
Wrap it up in 10 minutes or 5 minutes?
Inshallah.
How many?
10 minutes.
10 minutes, inshallah. Let me work on it. All right, barakallahu feek. Bismillah. So the recipients of zakat, just like everything has already been conditioned, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala defined which asset classes zakat has to be paid on, how to pay it, when to pay it. Also, who is qualified to receive it is also told to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Tawbah, where he mentions that إِنَّمَا الصَّدَقَاتُ لِلْفُقَرَاءِ, that charities are specifically here referring to zakat are only to be given to, number one, al-fuqara, and number two, al-masakin, the impoverished and the needy. There's a bit of a small difference between a faqir and a miskin. A faqir is somebody who, does not even have half of what is necessary to cover his own necessary expenses to survive or the expenses of his or her family. A miskin is somebody who has more than half but does not have the full amount to cover their necessary expenses. So let's say their monthly expenses are like 3,000 and all they receive on a monthly basis in income is 2,800. This person would be, in this case, a miskin because they don't have the full amount. A faqir is somebody who has much less than that. And those are the ones who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala started the ayah with. Those are the ones who the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he sent Mu'adh to Yemen, he told him, tell them that if they accept Islam, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mandated a charity that will be taken from their wealthy and given back to their poor. So these are the primary and of the most important recipients of zakat. How much can you give them? If you know that somebody is in such a situation, you can give them up to a year of their necessary expenses. So you can cover their rent, for example, for a year, or what it costs to provide for themselves and their families for 1 year if they don't have enough to do that. The recipient should not be somebody who is strong and able to earn. Prophet ﷺ said, "La hadda fiha lighani wa la liqawiyyin muktasib," that a person who receives zakat because they're poor should not be someone who's able to go out and earn a living. We're not talking about somebody who cannot find work. We're talking about somebody who just does not want to go work. This person would not be entitled to receive zakat. And you have to start local. You have to start with the people that are around you. Believe me, there are a lot of impoverished Muslims even living in America. I read a report recently that said almost half are living below or close to the poverty line. I know that goes based on their income taxes and how much they're filing that they're earning, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. They are out there and you have to start locally. Many scholars consider it impermissible, and some even said it's invalid if you send it to another country when there are people around you in your locality that are in need. It could in some cases be sent outside if there are people who are in a more dire need, or for example, you have relatives who are in need that live in a different country. You can prioritize them in that case, but all else being equal, you have to start locally. That's very important. And if you do transfer money to cover, let's say, the expenses of a very poor family member back home, you have to cover the transfer expense. So if the transfer expense with Western Union is $20, that's not going to be taken out of your zakat. You have to pay that. You have to pay that out of your pocket. And it cannot be given to family members that you have to spend on. So if a father, for example, has a son, let's say an older son with a family, and that son is poor, in that case, that father is obligated to spend on his son, even though his son is older. So he cannot give him zakat. Likewise, a son cannot give his father or his mother zakat if they are poor. A husband cannot give his wife zakat if she is poor because he's obligated to spend on her. However, a wife, if she has money or she has, let's say, jewelry or she has any wealth, and her husband is somebody who is poor, is not able to provide for the family, based on the definition of a faqir or miskin that I gave, she can give him from her zakat al-mal, because Zainab, the wife of Ibn Mas'ud, the Prophet ﷺ recommended to her that she gives him and his children, even though that is her husband. So those are the first two categories. Thirdly, for reconciling hearts, mu'allafati qulub. So this is a very controversial topic as well. However, these are people who, by giving them zakat, even if they are not Muslim, by the way, I forgot to mention, the fuqara and the masakin, if they're given for those reasons, and all the other zakat recipients have to be Muslim. Yes, they have to be Muslim. And this is the only exception. for reconciling hearts. If there is somebody who, by being given zakat money, even if they're not that poor and they're not Muslim, but you are certain that this would at least draw them closer to Islam, or there are somebody who just accepted Islam, for example, and they're already shaken in their faith and they're going through some financial difficulties, but they're not necessarily poor. They're not masakeen. You can give them in order to draw their hearts closer to Islam. It can also be used for freeing slaves. I don't know if anyone knows, anyone who's still not yet emancipated, but yes, it can be used for freeing slaves, for prisoners of war, for ransoms even if somebody was taken as a ransom and we did not have the money, or that person's family did not have the money to get them out of kidnapping, for example, this money can be used towards it. And this shows you how Islam emphasized the freeing of slaves, because it is one of the maqasid of the Sharia. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prefers for the servants to be free so that they can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and not have obligations owed to anyone else. So they are a category that is qualified to receive zakat. Number 4, al-gharimin. Al-gharimin are those who are in debt. But again, it's not somebody who simply has a 30-year mortgage. It is somebody who has a debt that is owed and they do not have the money to cover that debt. This is important. They have a debt that is past due. It's not like something that he doesn't owe for another month. It is past due. And number 3, they do not have the money to cover that debt. This person would fall into that category of al-gharimin, and you can give them money that has to be used specifically towards paying off their past due debts. The next category, wa fi sabilillah. This is also a very controversial topic, especially today's times. Traditionally, or according to the majority of scholars of the past, this was restricted to fighters who would go out and fight, and they were not receiving any income as soldiers for from the Islamic government. So you were allowed to give them money to help them cover their expenses on the expeditions, military expeditions that they went on. Other scholars have broadened the scope of what fi sabilillah means. We can't say it means everything that's fi sabilillah, because that would subsume all the other categories that we mentioned, like for reconciling hearts, freeing slaves, giving it to the poor and needy, because that's considered fi sabilillah as well. So some scholars said that any intellectual jihad counts as fi sabilillah in this category. So those organizations that receive money to spread and propagate Islam, for example, to teach people, those who are skilled in apologetics, that defend Islam or call others by preaching through da'wah, so on and so forth, because that is more effective in bringing people closer to Islam than just fighting, then they can be included in that category. Now, does that count for masajid as well? This is also something that's very controversial. My teacher, Dr. Hatim al-Hajj, wrote a beautiful article on this. You can easily find it by searching Dr. Hatim al-Hajj, Masjid Zakat. I'm sure you'll pull it up on Google. But just to summarize it, it should be a last resort. Muslims should not be restricting what they give every year or what they give their masajid to simply the 2.5% of their zakat. No, 2.5% is the minimum. You know, Christians, they tithe about 10%. A lot of them do, 10% of their income, not just of their assets over the course of the year, of their income. So as Muslims, especially living in the West, in order to grow our communities and spread Islam, 2.5% cannot be the minimum, or it cannot be the maximum that we give. No, that should be the minimum, and then we give in addition to that. But if there is a masjid and the community is in a need of that masjid because there's nowhere for them to pray, or it's too small and needs to be expanded because the community is growing and it does not have the space to accommodate them, and they're not receiving enough voluntary sadaqahs to cover that, then as a last resort, after after exploring all other options and exhausting all other options, then yes, they can use zakat money because it is a dire need. Masajid are absolutely necessary for the community, for Muslims to pray in. So if that is a case where they cannot receive enough funding by any other means, then they can resort to collecting zakat, especially if that masjid is active in propagating Islam. You know, if it's just a masjid that has the 5 daily salawat, you walk in and you walk out, then it's likely you're not going to need zakat money, of course. In that case, you cannot give them zakat because number one, they don't need it. Number two, they're not really doing much for spreading Islam. You should be giving them from your voluntary sadaqah. Yes, that is great. Absolutely. Definitely encourage that. But for your zakat specifically, be careful and make sure that you're giving it to the masajid or the organizations that actually deserve it. Not every organization that claims to be zakat eligible is actually zakat eligible, and it is your responsibility as someone who's paying the zakat to investigate. You can't just give your money left and right. You can't just walk down the street and just give your zakat to a random person. You would owe it again. If you did that and you ended up giving it to somebody who, for example, was wealthy by accident, or somebody who was not Muslim by accident. So even when it comes to organizations that consider themselves fi sabilillah, you need to do that investigation as well. The wayfarers, that's the last category, ibn sabil, those are travelers. This can actually include in modern times, let's say refugees who have money back home. They had to flee their country, like from Sham, Iraq, or any other country due to war, for example, or whatever the case may be. They have money back home, so they're not faqir, but they don't have access to the money. So therefore, they would be able to receive zakat money in that case if they needed it under the category of ibn sabil or a wayfarer. Because a wayfarer back then could be rich back home, but because they didn't have credit cards, of course, he could have run out of money in his journey, even though he's rich back home when he gets back to his homeland. But where he is currently in his travels, he doesn't have a dollar to his name. They would be able to receive zakat in that situation as well. This is literally, I think this is the last slide, 401k investments. If you have a 401k plan, yes, you definitely have to pay zakat on. Allah knows best. I know there are some who said you don't have to, or you could pay just 10% off the profit when you have access to the money. But if you voluntarily chose to put your money in a 401k plan and you're investing in stocks, you certainly should be paying zakat on it. You don't necessarily have to pay on the whole amount because you don't have access to the whole amount. You can only withdraw a certain percentage till you reach the age of 59 and a half. And even then, you would still have to pay taxes on whatever you withdraw. Based on this, Dr. Hatem Hajj did the math and said that if you have a 401k with long-term in stock investments, it's not being actively traded, buying and selling short-term. And those who have 401ks, if you don't, you might not understand what I'm discussing. If you do, or if you looked into them before, then you would know that you have the choice to be aggressive in your investments or more conservative and hold on to long-term stock investments. In that case, you would only pay, if you're somebody who's under 59 and a half, who's not yet able to withdraw without penalty, you'd only owe 0.5% on the whole amount, not 2.5%, because we had to reduce that amount because you don't have access to the full amount. And secondly, because with long-term investments, long-term stocks, if you buy a long-term stock, or let's say you buy a stock like Apple with the intention of holding on to it for the long term, you're not looking to sell it for a quick profit, it would have a different set of rules when it comes to the zakat. It wouldn't be traded, it wouldn't be dealt with as trade goods or merchandise that you pay yearly on based on its value. You would only be paying based on the companies. You would have to look in the balance sheet, see how much inventory and how much cash they have. And because your share in that company is a certain percentage ownership, you would be just paying based on that. But just to make it easier, Dr. Hatem Hajmi, Allah rewarded him, did the math. He said if you have a 401k plan and you're under the age where you can withdraw without penalty, you simply have to pay 0.5%. I would suggest, I don't have a 401k plan. If I did, if I felt that it's safe to do so and the companies out there are halal to invest in, I likely would pay a lot more than 0.5%, only because we are sure that even if you're as careful as you want to be in avoiding haram companies, yes, the companies that you're involved in are likely dealing in interest. They're likely buying and selling in haram as well to some extent, or involved in transactions which would not be considered Sharia compliant. So to be safer and to purify your money, I would suggest being more generous, especially with stocks, paying the full 2.5%, especially if you had a good year. But if you don't, then the 0.5% is a minimum amount that Dr. Hachem had mentioned. And wallahi, it's a very light obligation. I mean, compared to sales tax, for example, that pay 30%, property tax, real estate tax, estate tax if somebody dies, for example, sales tax, almost 9% in New York City. I mean, wallahi, 2.5% on your money that you've had for over a year. Because if you use that money and you bought a house, or you bought a car, or you went on a vacation with your family, you did Umrah, and you don't have it at the end of the year, you don't owe anything. Whereas taxes, the money is taken up front. With zakat, it's only taken if you've had that money sitting with you for an entire year. Wallahi, we could not have asked for a more fair and merciful ruling than the ruling that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us in zakat, and to do it in good spirits. Don't do it when you're paying your zakat. Don't treat it like you're paying a summons or a violation. Do it in good spirits, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised the Bedouins who did it, who saw it as an opportunity to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and draw closer to Him. versus those who treated it like a fine. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to benefit from what we heard. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to be amongst those who fulfill their obligations to Him in all that He has enjoined upon us. أقول كما سمعتم وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه بارك الله فيكم. Inshallah, we'll open the door to some questions.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Tarek. This is a very thorough presentation. So inshallah, if you have any questions, you can either send it on the chat or you can raise your hand and we can unmute you, inshallah, and you can ask directly. If you want to like
somebody's tagging up my presentation.
Yeah, if you want to like stop sharing. So
oh, okay, stop sharing. Let me see.
Yeah, and then it'll go away, inshallah.
All right, let me see if I can figure that out.
But okay, so we have a first question on the chat. Are your needy relatives who are deemed poor prioritized then locally for zakah?
Yes, that's what, according to many scholars, probably, based on al-aqrabuna awla bil ma'ruf, those who are closer to you in relation, blood relation, are more deserving of your good works. And also because it counts for two. It counts as a sila, which is like, a means of improving your ties of kinship with that relative. And secondly, because if they are actually needy, by helping somebody who is poor. So if you have a needy relative, and they're not somebody they have to spend on, like I mentioned, not all relatives are qualified. Like, for example, if you have a young, let's say, God forbid, someone's parents passed away and they take care of their younger brother, and that younger brother has no one else to take care of them. In that case, that brother or that younger sister, for example, is somebody who you are responsible for spending on. Therefore, you cannot be giving them zakat. It's only like for relatives that you don't have to spend on, like cousins, for example, uncles, aunts, for example, so on and so forth. Not grandparents or grandkids. They are somebody who you would have to spend on if they were in need and nobody else was there to spend on. So yes, in that case, you could start by sending it abroad. However, I would suggest distributing it, not limiting it only to the relatives that you have overseas. Definitely prioritize the people around you who are in dire need as well. You can split it up so that they get a portion of your zakat, and the local people that you know who are not necessarily related to you receive a portion of that zakat as well. Or you could send, again, nobody's restricting it to 2.5% alone to the mandatory zakat. It's suggested that you give much more, especially if you are able to do so, to give them from your voluntary sadaqah as well. So yes, for that reason, they would be prioritized, and Allah knows best.
Okay, there's another question. What about the land we buy as investment if we buy and keep the lots for a few years?
If you buy it for the intention of turning it into a profit by selling it for a profit, and that's the reason why you purchased it, in such a case, yes, it should be paid every year based on the value of it on your zakat due. So obviously property values changed. So let's say a person pays every 27th of Ramadan, they would look at the value at that time and pay based on that value. If their intention was to sell it for a profit, even if they held it for a long time. There is another opinion that if their intention was to hold it for a while because they know the market is not that good now, but it's going to be good 3 years, 4 years down the road, that when they sell it, they can just pay 1 year worth of zakat based on the value at that time. That is an opinion. I would suggest going with the other opinion as long as the property is sellable and there's some level of demand for it where you would be making a profit to pay yearly on it. But if it's not sellable and you had ended up holding on to it for a few years for that reason, then you could just pay 1 year of zakat when you sell it. But I would suggest speaking with a scholar, a mufti, like I mentioned in the beginning, Amja, for example, about the details, because the details can give you a different ruling.
Another question, can we estimate how much we have in total while subtracting what we saved that hasn't been a year?
Yeah, so what happens is that it's going to be very difficult if you're going to basically, every time you receive a paycheck from work, put it in an envelope, write the date that you received on it. Nobody's going to do that. Some scholars, it was easier in the past because people would make, let's say, one big trade, رحلة الشتاء والصيف, in the summer or in the winter, for example, and that would be enough for them for the next 6 months. But now people are receiving money on a weekly basis from their employer. In this case, the easier opinion, and it's the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa, is that you look at what you have every year and you just pay based on what you have that date. So you're going to be paying some of your wealth earlier. You're going to be giving zakat on it earlier than its due date, because if your paycheck that you received last week is included in that amount, then you're already paying zakat on it, even though a whole year hasn't passed. But that's okay, because it's okay to advance your zakat. If you wanted to go the other more difficult approach, I can't help you, because you would have to do a lot of work to figure out how much you owe for every paycheck that you received, or every income that came your direction.
Okay, I don't think there are any more questions. If anybody has any, okay, someone just submitted. If you are on a fixed income, Social Security, you don't get enough to take care of yourself through the month. You need a job after retirement, but for health reasons, you can't work right now. Do you have a zakat on the money? I'm guessing you have to pay zakat on the money.
Gotcha. I'll answer that question. I'm going to go back to the last one real quick. I just wanted to mention, if you are somebody who receives money on a weekly basis from your employer, and then a month before your zakat due date, you got a big lump sum, for example, let's say, God forbid, a wealthy relative passed away and you received, $100,000 in inheritance. You could treat that money separately and wait a year to pay your zakat on it. In that case, because this is like a lump sum that's coming to you that's out of the ordinary, whereas the money that you're saving from your weekly income, for example, from your employer, that you can just pay on one day every year. And like I mentioned, you end up paying a little early on some of it. So now, as far as what the sister asked about the fixed income, you don't have enough to take care of yourself throughout the month. Well, if a person does not have enough to take care of themselves throughout the month, then they would be considered somebody who is needy. In this case, they are a recipient, somebody who's qualified to receive zakat as a miskin. And you need another job after retirement for health reasons. You can't work with that. It sounds like, the person's situation, Allah knows best. They don't have enough to take care of themselves. And they can't find work, for example, or their health does not permit it. Then they would be somebody who is qualified to receive zakat in this case, and they wouldn't have to owe if they don't have that $404 amount over a year. And Allah knows best. Is the zakat due date the same time every year? Yes, it depends on when because it could be different for everyone. So for example, somebody that had no money their entire life, then comes the 1st of Muharram. They receive $1,000, $5,000 check, for example. Their zakat due date would be the 1st of Muharram 1 year later. So it's not Ramadan necessarily. It's just people like to pay in Ramadan, seeking out Laylatul Qadr, for example. But it's not necessarily Ramadan. It's based on the date that you first became obligated to pay zakat. So when you receive that money, which is over $400, depending on what day that was, if it's the 1st of Muharram, 1 year later would be your zakat due date. But again, like we mentioned, you could pay ahead of time if you wish. And if somebody has any other live questions, inshallah, we'll answer them. If not, I guess we'll call it a day. Barakallahu feekum. Like I mentioned, what about tax refunds? Should those be factored in? Yeah, tax refunds are kind of like what I mentioned. If you receive a lump sum, so somebody just received a tax refund for $10,000, for example, and they were planning to pay, their zakat due date is in Ramadan, and they just received a tax refund, a week or two ago. They could include it. That would be the more generous thing to do. They could include it in the total amount that they pay with their other zakatable assets, or they could say, you know what, this 10,000, I'm going to put it in a separate account, and that's your responsibility to keep track. You shouldn't be negligent. If you're negligent and you forget, you could be sinful for your negligence. You need to keep track. All right, that 10,000, I'm going to put it in this account. Remind myself that I owe zakat on it this time next year. This is the money that I received as a tax refund, and then you could do that. But again, if you're going to forget, most people do, just include it with the other money that you pay when you pay on your zakat due date. Okay, I don't see any other questions. And if nobody has any other live questions that they'd like to ask, I apologize if I put anyone to sleep. I almost put myself to sleep, I'll be honest. But it is definitely a difficult subject. It's it's not one of those subjects that necessarily give you a spiritual boost. However, your knowledge of it and the wisdom behind it and seeing how it works does definitely increase your iman, because you see what a perfect system Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has legislated for us, and no one has been able to match it with any man-made system. So we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for that. And if you have any finishing remarks, sister, inshallah, I'll leave it to you.
The last question says, when you said to combine your value of gold and silver, are you saying to combine both values?
All right, so this is a good question. If somebody has, we mentioned 595 grams of silver is the threshold for silver, and 585 grams is the threshold for gold. Okay, so the scholars mentioned, Imam Shafi'i had a different view, may Allah have mercy on him. The other scholars, the other madhab have mentioned that if you have half of the nisab of gold and half of the nisab of silver, you have two halves, which make a whole. In this case, yes, you would pay zakat on both categories. Likewise, if you have half the nisab of gold, you have, let's say, 45 grams of gold, but you also have half the nisab in cash. You have 200, let's say, $250 in cash. In this case, together, when we combine the half of the nisab you have in cash, the half of the nisab you have in gold, together you have the whole. So you should pay zakat on it in that case as well. Make sense?
Okay, inshallah. I don't think there are any more questions. Jazakumullah khair, Brother Tarek. Inshallah, we will be sending out this recording bi'idhnillah. So if anybody's interested in reviewing and also the PowerPoint, inshallah, slides, because I know some people asked. So we will be sending it out through email, inshallah.
Inshallah ta'ala. Barakallahu feekum. If anyone has any questions, I included they'll be able to find the phone number for Amja in the slides. Alhamdulillah, they're a very invaluable resource. Definitely take advantage of it. And, if you're not sure, ask.